Auto sequence initiated, flight. Roger. Roger, how's the look, Econ? Got your space?
That's good, flight.
Okay. Ignition, flight.
On the evening of April 13, 1970, NASA's Apollo 13 crew was 200,000 miles from home, hurtling through space and closing in on their target, the Moon.
We show 13 at an altitude of 174,664 nautical miles, and this is Apollo Control, Houston.
Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin had already made history touching down on the lunar surface first. And despite some launch drama, Apollo 12 also had a successful lunar landing mission. So for Mission Commander Jim Lovell, Command Module Pilot Jack Swigert, and Lunar Module Pilot Fred Hayes, Apollo 13 should have been the third-time charm. But it wasn't.
No one could believe that an explosion that disastrous had happened.
The only thing they could do was look out the window, try to hold it steady.
Very critical, because if it was too steep, the sudden acceleration would make us a fiery meteor for just a few seconds, and that would be it.
This is the crew of Apollo 13, wishing everybody there a nice evening, and
The crew has just wrapped up a live TV broadcast showing those on Earth how comfortably they can live and work in zero gravity.
we're just about ready to close out our inspection of Aquarius and get back for a pleasant evening at Odyssey. Good night.
Mission Control asks Apollo 13 for their last checklist item that evening.
13, we've got one more item for you when you get a chance. We'd like it to stir up your cryo tanks.
The cryo tanks are the oxygen tanks. The power fans were turned on within the tank for the third cryo stir of the mission, a procedure to stir the oxygen slush inside the tank to avoid settling. What happens next is unimaginable. The crew hears a loud bang. One of the two oxygen tanks has just exploded.
Okay, Houston, we've had a problem here.
The spacecraft has suffered a catastrophic emergency. Unbeknownst to the crew, the service module now has a gaping hole in its side. Yet, by some miracle, the crew is alive.
This is Houston. Say again, please.
Houston, we've had a problem.
The explosion sets off a domino of disasters for the crew. Warning lights indicate the loss of 2 of the 3 fuel cells, the spacecraft's primary source of electricity and life support. Water supply is cut off. Oxygen tank 1 is empty.
Our O2 quantity number 2 tank is reading 0. Did you get that?
The second oxygen tank is rapidly depleting.
What happened on the service module was a double failure. A manifold blew out that took out both fuel cell power systems. There was no power on the vehicle, except for the batteries in the command module.
The quick-thinking crew tries to close the hatch between the command and lunar modules to protect their oxygen supply.
Continuing to troubleshoot with the Apollo 13 crew, closely watching oxygen quantities and pressures in the command module.
But the hatch lid won't stay shut, so they secure it with a strap. 13 minutes after the explosion, Lovell just happens to look out the left-hand window and sees something venting. He reports to Mission Control.
We are venting something out into space.
Roger, we copy your venting.
Lovell's lucky glance warns the crew of another potential catastrophe. The venting is precious oxygen rapidly escaping the second and only remaining oxygen tank. Without oxygen, the crew is doomed. Not only does it supply the breathing air, but the fuel cells need oxygen and hydrogen to provide water and power to the spacecraft. And now the fuel cells were dying. The command module batteries had to be saved for re-entry, which was days away. Time is of the essence. astronauts, flight controllers, and engineers across America get to work. They must invent a plan to bring the crew home alive. One challenge is to find a trajectory to bring the crippled spacecraft home safely. The crew must change course because they are heading straight for the moon. As oxygen levels near zero, NASA begins planning for an alternate mission. They propose a radical idea.
It's slowly going to zero, and we're starting to think about LEM lifeboat.
The crew agrees.
Yeah, that's what we're thinking about too.
They will use the lunar module to keep the crew alive and to get them onto a return-to-Earth trajectory.
We now show an altitude of 180,521 nautical miles. Here in Mission Control, we're now looking towards an alternate mission, swinging around the moon and using the lunar module power systems because of the situation that has developed here this evening.
This free return trajectory uses the moon's gravitational force to propel them back home. Flight Director Glenn Lunny assures the world with caution.
We think we have the situation in control. We've projected the consumables as I've described, and we have a plan for carrying out the rest of the mission, but there's going to be no relaxation at all as far as that goes from now until splash.
Next, to preserve critical power for their return, they shut down the command module and will go to minimum power in the lunar module, or LEM.
The Apollo 13 problem was a shortage of power. So everything had to be shut down, and the question was, can we turn off the gyroscopes? Can we turn off the heaters? We had to turn it back on again for the re-entry, and could we do that? You thought it over very carefully about what was inside these inertial instruments. Would anything break? Would they come back on again? That's what you worried about.
And finally, they have to figure out a navigation plan. Exactly how, when, and in what attitude would they burn the lunar module descent engine to provide a quick return home?
The lunar excursion module, the LEM, it was designed to land on the moon, but it wasn't designed to control everything coming back to Earth.
Completely new procedures had to be written and tested in the simulator before being passed up to the crew. With only 15 minutes of power left in the command module, Capcom Jack Lausma instructs the crew to make their way into the LEM.
Flight Econ. Go ahead, Econ. The pressure in O2 tank 1 is all the way down to 297. We better think about getting in the LEM or using the LEM systems.
The LEM was designed to supply only enough oxygen and power to support 2 men for 2 days, but it was being asked to care for 3 men for 4 days. To conserve power, the crew shuts off all but the life-sustaining systems in the LEM. Water is another huge concern. They needed to cool systems and keep the crew hydrated.
We're at this time water critical in the LEM, so we'd like to use as little as possible.
The crew cuts down their intake to 6 ounces each per day. They would be dangerously dehydrated throughout the return. Carbon dioxide is another major problem. Day 2 in the LEM. A warning light indicates dangerous levels of CO2 buildup. They have to figure out a way to soak up the carbon dioxide they are exhaling. There were square filters to remove CO2 from the spacecraft in the command module and round receptacles in the LEM. Engineers on the ground scramble to find a way to fit a square peg into a round hole. Their solution requires spacesuit parts, socks, a flight manual cover, and duct tape. The crew hacks a new system while combating the effects of poisonous gas building up inside. Once the CO2 crisis is over, everyone immediately turns their attention to the biggest challenge of all: navigation. Apollo 13 is still heading straight for the moon. Somehow, they must change their course to a return to Earth trajectory, or the entire crew will perish. The only option is to push, using the lunar module's descent engine, a risky maneuver that had never been tested.
So there was some point between the explosion and the realization that their only way home was to push, that we had to start doing those simulations.
The lunar module was equipped with the same navigation and guidance system as the command module, but with different software. Engineers who designed the system weren't sure if the LEM would be able to handle navigation for the entire spacecraft in powered flight.
As soon as it happened, and as soon as we learned the problem, immediately the question was asked to me, can your simulator simulate the lunar module pushing the command module back home?
The lunar module was controlling the combination of the command module and the service module. So that was the biggest challenge for that mission, is that we had to work out in real time new algorithms.
We had to answer the question, when the lunar module fires its engine to push the command module, is the whole thing going to break in half and fly apart? Nobody comes home. There is no recovery. We didn't have 2 weeks, we didn't have a day. We had hours. Doing the simulation was kind of important. They wanted to know if it was going to work.
We ran all sorts of tests. We didn't have a lot of time, and that happened, and there was essentially a day to get all sorts of analysis and testing done.
As the astronauts close in on the moon, ground engineers calculate various options to get them home. Each carries its own risk, and they are running out of time. Flight directors Gene Kranz and Chris Kraft picked the option that requires 2 major trajectory corrections powered by the LEM descent engine. The crew is able to transfer the command module's navigation platform to the LEM. But first, the LEM's navigation system must be realigned.
The computer could tell us actually how to get back home if we had a problem en route to the moon. I had to manually and look outside to see the stars and then move the spacecraft around and then try to get the stars into the optics, and so that I could do the alignment that way.
Ordinarily, the spacecraft uses star points and the onboard navigation and optics system to align the spacecraft for mid-course maneuvers. But Lovell must do it by eye, manually, through the ship's window.
Take a look. We'd like to know if you can see stars for alignment purposes.
No, we're not able to. Whatever debris came away at the time of the mishap is still with us, but we do have the Earth and Moon, and that could be of assistance.
Explosion debris swirling outside the spacecraft makes it impossible to sight real stars, so Lovell uses the Sun instead as an alignment star. Luckily, Commander Lovell is the only astronaut uniquely trained for this difficult task because of a mistake he made just over a year earlier as a navigator on Apollo 8.
Houston, Apollo 8. Apollo 8, Houston, go ahead. Roger, for some reason we suddenly got program 01 and a no attitude light on our computer.
Pushed the wrong button, actually telling the computer and the guidance system that we were back on the launch pad. So we had to manually then go look at the stars and realign the platform, which we successfully did. A year or so later on Apollo 13, when we had to turn off our computer, turn off our guidance system to save power, I was pretty confident that I could get our alignment back again, and basically because of the training I had inadvertently on Apollo 8.
With the navigation system aligned, the crew prepares to change course for home.
This is Apollo Control. At the present time, the Flight Dynamics Officer here in Mission Control is computing a maneuver to place Apollo 13 back on a free return trajectory.
The alignment with the Sun proves to be less than 1/2 a degree off, giving the crew confidence they can execute the life-saving burn necessary to get them on course for Earth.
What do you got? Get ready, upper right corner. We got it. Houston, Aquarius. Okay, it looks like the front checked out.
I understand it checks out. We're kind of glad to hear that.
They had no attitude reference. The inertial guidance system was not on. And so they were trying to steer that whole conglomeration, the command module and the LEM, steer the whole thing so that they could do the mid-course correction in the right direction. And the only thing they could do was look out the window of the LEM and try to hold it steady.
A 35-second burn allows Apollo 13 to swing around the moon onto a free return to Earth course.
One of the most impressive things that they were able to do was to target that trajectory and burn and actually control the vehicle to get back to that trajectory by hand. That to me is one of the most amazing things.
About 18 hours later, after rounding the far side of the moon, they initiate the second burn to speed up their return.
An enormous relief when the burn happened and it didn't come apart. Just an incredible sense of relief.
While the world waits, the crew is on their way home. Strict food and water rations, freezing temperatures, and condensation forming all over makes it a difficult 2.5-day journey. Sleep is virtually impossible.
So the 3 days coming back were nerve-wracking because they had to just survive.
As the crew approaches re-entry to Earth, they crawl back into a cold, dark command module to make sure they can restart the guidance system.
We were forced to shut that system down with no power. It was never designed to do that.
The critical components of the guidance system are the computer and an inertial measurement unit with stabilizing gyroscopes.
The inertial system was a crucial element.
The gyros were filled with fluid, and the fluid had to be maintained at like 154 degrees Fahrenheit.
The gyroscopes were exposed to a drastic drop in temperature as a result of power failures after the explosion.
The worst fear is they wouldn't start when you turn them on. And if you did turn them on, did you have enough performance to even get into the entry corridor?
Engineers needed to test the gyroscopes on Earth and quickly report results to Mission Control.
The one thing that we did was to take guidance systems and shove them in the freezer, while this was all going on, just to figure out what might happen.
Here at the laboratory, we did days of testing, and we put them in refrigerators, put them in car trunks, then brought them in to test them, to start them, and see what kind of performance we could get. Most of the time they worked, but once in a while they didn't. So there was always an element of doubt.
There was a big question whether the gyros would even turn on.
Ready to start primary?
It is go time. The crew attempts to power up the command module.
Go with the primary. Okay, y'all one? Good. This one? Okay.
And it works. But as the spacecraft nears re-entry, ground tracking detects an unexpected change in trajectory. This could spell disaster for the crew.
Very critical because we were too shallow. We would skip off like skipping a stone on water. If it was too steep, the sudden acceleration would make us a fiery meteor for just a few seconds, and that would be it.
Mission Control decides to do one last course correction.
Appear to be possibly taking us away from the place we know we want to be in the ball.
Once again, they turn to Jim Lovell, the only astronaut uniquely qualified from his time aboard Apollo 8.
One of the things they trained on was how you'd restart the navigation fix in the computers while coming back to Earth.
It was a program that if we had lost our guidance system completely and we're coming back, how can we make a final maneuver to sort of get back into the proper position to make a safe landing?
Using the LEM's attitude control rockets, Lovell performs a manual burn to make sure they hit their re-entry target.
And so on 8, he did it. And the only other time they used that type of reinitialization of the navigation system was on 13. And they happened to have the one person who was experienced in doing it on board the vehicle with Jim Lovell.
It was an emergency procedure, but it came in pretty handy on Apollo 13 when that was the way we made our final maneuver to get back into the Earth's atmosphere.
4 hours before landing, the crew faces their next hurdle.
Command module has to separate from the service module. It wasn't known that the separation was going to work.
But it does. As the module drifts away, the crew is able to photograph the wreckage, revealing just how lucky they are.
And that's when we saw this incredible explosion on the side of the service module.
And there's one whole side of that thing missing.
Is that right?
The whole panel is blown out, almost from the base to the engine. Really a mess. Man, that's unbelievable.
No one could believe that an explosion that disastrous had happened.
3 hours later, the crew leaves the lunar module Aquarius for good and prepares for the last hurdle. They jettison their lifeboat and brace for a fiery re-entry down a narrow corridor.
So it had 3 cold astronauts in it, but it just re-entered flawlessly like it'd been trained to do.
Apollo 13, this is recovery. We observed your RCS burn, over. The recovery, Apollo 13 is descending.
Odyssey Houston, standing by, over.
Moments later, with the entire world watching, they splash down gently in the Pacific Ocean near Samoa.
Odyssey Houston, we show you on the mains. It really looks great.
Apollo 13 did not land on the moon, but thanks to the incredible efforts of its crew and the tremendous ingenuity of experts on the ground, the astronauts made it safely home. After an intense investigation, the Apollo 13 Accident Review Board identified the cause of the explosion. During a final launch pad test before the mission, the oxygen tank heaters were left on too long, degrading some of the fan's wire insulation, causing a short circuit. Through this remarkable post-mission laboratory test, engineers determined that when the exposed fan wires shorted, the Teflon insulation caught fire, triggering a massive oxygen-fueled explosion. That explosion took place on April 13, 1970, when the crew of Apollo 13 was more than 200,000 miles from home.